Dear viewers, it's a pleasure to introduce you to Professor Dr. Cas Mudde, a renowned researcher and expert in the field of right-wing extremism and right-wing populism. Professor Mudde currently holds the chair of international affairs at the University of Georgia in the US, and he is an adjunct professor at the University of Oslo for the Center for Research on Extremism, short CREX. And in his academic work, he focuses on topics of extremism, democracy, political parties, and social movements. And Professor Mudde is the author of numerous influential publications about right-wing politics, such as Populist Radical Right Parties in Europe, published in 2007, or Populism, a very short introduction, published in 2017, and the Far Right Today, published in 2019. His works are essential for understanding the dynamics and developments of far-right movements and populist parties in Europe and also North America. In addition to his academic activities, Professor Mudde is also a columnist for The Guardian US and a regular contributor to Vox Europe. And he also explores various radical aspects of politics, music, and sports in his podcast called Radical. We are delighted to speak with Professor Mudde today in the aftermath of the European Parliament election. Professor Mudde, thank you for offering us your expertise on right-wing politics. And now I would like to start by asking questions about the history of the European right-wing politics. And my first question would be, how do current right-wing populist movements compared to earlier far-right movements in Europe's history, such as fascism or neo-Nazism?
Yeah, I think there are two major questions. One is ideological and one is organizational. And the differences organizationally are probably even more pronounced than ideologically these days, although fundamentally are different. So first of all, fascist parties and fascist movements, I would say, Nazi movement, they were very large. They were so-called mass movements. And they had a party, and then generally they had various other auxiliary organizations that would mobilize constantly in these big marches. And that is what we now associate very strongly with fascism, to put it simply. However, they were probably much more representative simply of mass movement of the time, because the Catholic movement, for example, the socialist movement, the communist movement, they all had this kind of structure. In the post-war period, particularly since the late 60s, political parties have become more isolated from broader movements, more professional, smaller. And so many of the radical right parties today are just reasonably professional parties. They do have a larger organization, but nothing like the old Nazis, right? So you don't have these mass rallies anymore and with fire and flags and whatever. But more importantly, ideologically, now 10, 15 years ago, I would have said the big difference is that in the 20s, 30s, the far right was anti-democratic, right? They were not just against minority rights, they were against the whole fundamental logic of democracy. One person, one vote. After all, you had a superior being in the Führer, right? And he knew better than everyone else. So that is still the case, but I would have said that the post-war far right was radical right in the sense that they embrace democracy, they believe in democracy, but they have problems with liberal aspects of democracy, particularly separation of powers, minority rights, rule of law. Today, that is not so clear anymore because you have parties like Fidesz, for example, in Hungary, which claims to be democratic, but is undermining not just liberal aspects of democracy, but democratic aspects. The BJP in India, and probably the most clear example is actually the Republican Party in the US, which denies the legitimate outcome of the last election, which was the best and most democratic organized election in the history of the US, which has a leader who regularly states his disdain of democracy. Now, the big difference, though, is in the 20s, 30s, fascism was proud and open about its opposition against democracy. Today, parties like the Republican Party will support the insurrection, like a coup d'etat attempt, by arguing that they tried to save democracy. Right? And so you have an anti-democratic action covered by pro-democracy narrative. And we see that increasingly, like with parties, far-right parties that are longer in power. And so there is a fundamental difference still. I'm not saying the Republican Party is like the Nazis. I'm not sure whether, first of all, they have an ideology of an alternative system, but they're also not actually just anti-liberal democracy. Some of these parties clearly also want to change the Democratic Party, at least to such an extent that it doesn't actually function as a democracy anymore.
And do you think it's a problem, or is it helpful to compare those two things? Is it helpful to get the danger of it, or is it a problem because it isn't exactly the same? What do you think about this?
So I'm a comparativist, and I think you should compare everything to everything. I think the 1930s is a comparative frame. I don't think it's the most useful one for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's not only the threat that is different in the sense that we have an open anti-democratic opponent, enemy. You have a different debate with someone who is openly anti-democratic and one who hides it behind pro-democratic facade. Right? I don't think Hitler would ever have become upset if you said, you're not a Democrat. Right? And he wouldn't have said, oh, I am, but I just do it this, and that way. Today they do, and so you have a completely different debate. Much more important is democracy is not the same as in the 20s, 30s. Like yes, the Weimar Republic had a beautifully democratic constitution, but it had virtually no Democrats. Like the vast majority of Germans supported parties that were anti-democratic. There was no democratic legitimacy. Democracy was very contested as a system. Today, democracy, whatever people think it means, is hegemonic. And that explains in part that you can't be openly anti-democratic anymore. You have to tell people that the system you have, while it doesn't look like what we think is democracy, is the real democracy. So I think it's important. The context is fundamentally different. I also think that it raises the bar, right? If you say they are Nazis or they are fascists, by and large, the only thing they have to say is, look, we don't want to gas 6 million Jews. And then people who are kind of open to these parties will say, yeah, you see, they're not that radical, because the bar becomes insane, right? And so this is a problem of post-war politics, particularly in Germany and the Netherlands and some other countries, that the bar has become fascism. Fascism is the ultimate evil. So if you link it to them, then you know everyone is out. But we also have made a caricature as a consequence of the far-right threat. If they are not openly anti-democratic, if they're not openly racist, if they don't openly say we want to kill all the others, then they're the kind of moderate.
Our next question is going to compare again, so maybe you like it. How do right-wing populist parties differ across countries like, for example, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Netherlands, or Hungary, in terms of their ideologies, rhetoric, and support bases? You don't have to compare all of the countries for sure, but maybe you could pick some to make clear what the differences are.
Yeah, I think it's important not to overstate the differences. There are a lot of differences, but they're often on secondary points. In the core, they're nativist, the xenophobic form of nationalism. They're authoritarian, thinking that order is the most important thing, and you should really have strict law and order policies on everything, right? And I mean, some are populist, others are not. Now, there are differences in what they focus primarily on. Obviously, immigration is a more central point to the West Europeans than to the East Europeans, with the exception of Orban. But as soon as it can be mobilized, East Europeans will mobilize it too. There are some differences in the socioeconomic policy. For example, the Polish party is considered to be more left-wing, which is a very dubious term. I would say both Fidesz and PIS want some kind of nationalist capitalism. So they do support a market, but they want to make sure that the market is completely controlled by a national bourgeoisie, which is less the case with others. Front National, now Rassemblement National, actually is very much in favor of a stronger welfare state. Not so much redistribution of wealth, but more higher subsidies for certain groups. Often it's farmers, it is domestic families, or like indigenous families, or our own people. I think there are two important differences. One is organizational and kind of legacy. There's a significant group of radical right parties today, or far right parties today, that originated as conservative parties. And as a consequence, they still have part of the organization, membership, and voters of the old conservative parties. And they have what we call in academia a reputational shield. And that means that if you attack them as being far right, for a lot of people will say, oh no, they're not radical right, they're conservative. And they sound a bit more radical, but in the core, they're still one of us, right? They're the acceptable one. A party that starts from the outside doesn't have that. And if you want to make a comparison, AfD had that pretty much until Frauke Petry took over, right? But there was a whole debate, even when the party clearly moved to the radical right. Like, there was a debate that you would never have had with even the Republikaner. And so that is important because it creates kind of different parties. Particularly these conservative parties tend to be more governing oriented. They often have governing experience. Now, it's not new. It's not East European. After all, the FPÖ started out as a kind of a mainstream party. Of course, it changed a long time ago. The SVP in Switzerland was a conservative party that radicalized and became radical right. But there is a schism between these type of groups. The second is foreign policy. Now, foreign policy is always secondary, I mean, virtually for every party, but certainly also for the far right. There are parties that are very strongly pro-Russia. There are parties that are very strongly pro-America. Overall, most far-right parties want a multipolar world. And so they were not necessarily pro-Russia. They just wanted Russia to be strong enough that the US couldn't dominate. Now, today, there are a couple of parties that are still pro-Russia. Most are very small. But in the new European Parliament, there might be a new extreme right pro-Russia faction around AfD. And that will set itself strongly apart from the ECR, the group of Meloni, which has taken on board a very strong anti-Russia and to a certain extent pro-Ukraine position. So those are some of the major differences. In terms of electorate, it's mostly how big the electorate is. Like if you have an electorate of 5%, you will have a fairly specific electorate. If you have an electorate of almost 50%, like Orban, you have an electorate that is pretty much like the Nazis largely was, like just the Volkspartei, right? And so what we see is the bigger parties become, the less of a very clear electorate they have. Yes, it's always disproportionately white, and most of the time more male than female, but even that is decreasing now that parties become bigger and become more normalized.
Yeah.
And we have a new party in Germany, the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht. What do you think about this party? What is your opinion on it, and what do you think, where is it going to drift, or going to focus its politics?
Well, I think BSW was a hype, as Sarah Wagenknecht has been largely a media creation. The party has performed pretty much as I had expected, relatively poorly. Most of the hype was that she would get around 13 to 15%. She gets 5%. By and large, has no effect on AfD, but has killed off the left, which was dying anyway. So in that sense, I don't think it is a major, it's a major party. Now, we'll have to wait until the end of the year, because she could actually do a lot in the free East German state, Länder, where we have elections coming up, right? And then we will see whether it can establish itself and it can play a role. It's difficult to fit. We, in the literature, particularly a German scholar called Sarah Wagner, has argued that it's a left authoritarian party. So socioeconomically, it is clearly left, unlike far-right parties. Even the Rassemblement National is not clearly left. They don't want to redistribute wealth, mostly. Socioculturally, they're clearly on the right. That in itself is nothing new. Most communist parties were actually pretty conservative on sociocultural issues. It's just that she has made this bigger. On top of that, the media has very much pegged her as an anti-immigrant party, right? I still think, from what I can understand, the core of the party is socioeconomic. The core of the party is left-wing in the socioeconomic sense. And so I would not call it a far-right party, because for a far-right party, nativism is the core. Everything comes out of nativism. I think in the case of Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, it is the nativism that comes out of their socioeconomic vision. And it's a very old view within what we now call the radical left. And that is the argument that immigration puts pressure on the wages of the working class, right? And we see that, for example, in the Netherlands with the Socialist Party. We have seen that in France with the Communists. But it's always like, compared to the far right, they think foreigners are a problem for our identity. And like, they also push the wages down. So it is what is central. And I don't think for Sarah Wagenknecht, nativism is central. In her campaign, it was in part because that's where the media focused, and that's where she hoped to get votes.
Let's see. Yeah, thanks a lot for this analysis of this new party. We are still also very excited to see where this is going. We would like to move on to another subject, namely the reasons for the success of right-wing parties all over Europe. And we are interested in your analysis on what have been the primary social, economic, cultural, and political factors fueling the rise of right-wing populism across different European countries.
I mean, that's an incredibly big question. But most of the time, not all of the time, the far right came up at a time that there was an established political system And so it came out of protest, out of dissatisfaction with what mainstream parties had done, right? And or what people thought they had done, which is not always the same. What we know also from electoral research of decades and decades is that this is, particularly in Western Europe, first and foremost related to issues of immigration and multiculturalism. Socioeconomic anxiety plays much less of a role. It doesn't mean that it doesn't play a role. It could make nativism more important, right? So people already think that foreigners are lazy, are criminal, are unwanted. And then when they think that there is a huge number of immigrants in the country, they also think, oh, that is bad for the economy, right? Because either, well, actually both, like, so they steal our jobs and they live off our welfare state, right? But again, it is the nativism that drives that. It's not that they think, oh, I actually have no opinion about multiculturalism. My economic situation is bad. It's because of the foreigners. So what we also see is that in much research, individual voters do not necessarily think their own economic situation is bad. They think that the economic situation of the country is bad. Now, I think that is because they're nativists. Right? We know from research that voters from the far right have a very inflated view of how many foreigners there are in the country. Like by factors of 4 or 5, they think that there are 20%, for example, of Muslims. Now, if you think that there are 20% of the population that's Muslim, that's pretty much immersed in 40 years, then it is actually fairly rational that you will think you will become a Muslim majority country by 2050. If you think that Muslims are lazy and live off welfare, then the fact that you have 20% of the population living off welfare and is lazy and is growing, you will think that the economy of the country is going poorly, right? So again, the economy is secondary here. And we saw that most strikingly when Trump got elected. Like when Trump got elected in 2016, there was a jump of people who thought that the country was doing well economically of more than 10% within 1 week. And those were Trump supporters who just like thought it was all going well because the Democrats were in power. There are a lot of foreigners. And now there was Trump and he would kick them out. So this is crucial. In Eastern Europe, it's a bit different. There is a lot of nativism and it's always been important, but it used to be more focused on indigenous minorities, mostly Roma, for example, in Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, sometimes Russian speakers, whatever it is. The failure and particularly the corruption of other parties played a major role too. The corruption of socialist parties in Poland and in Hungary were absolutely crucial to the far right coming to power there. Corruption generally plays a major role. But what we also see more recently is that actually when the far right gets into power, they can also be rewarded for how they govern. And so we saw that in the case of both Poland and Hungary, where they had very targeted subsidies, particularly towards large families, towards rural areas. And people voted in support of that. So because the far right is becoming much more heterogeneous, the reasons for their success are much different. Like the far right in Ireland is less than 1% and completely out of power. Logically, they have different reasons for success and voting than Fidesz, which has been in power since 2010 and controls everything.
Well, if I may follow up with a little question, you pointed out that nativism is one of the major factors, but how do you explain that? Where does this nativism come from? And why wasn't it that relevant before in the voting behavior for people in the years, let's say in Germany in the 90s or something like that? Yeah.
So there are a variety of reasons. First of all, what is very important is that people are not more nativist today than they were before. Since we have a reliable research for, let's say, 3 decades, people have become overall just a little bit less nativist, which is mostly generational change. So it's not that older people obviously generally do not become more progressive. They don't change, right? But they die and are replaced by younger people who tend to be more progressive. Now, we didn't have these type of studies in the 50s, 60s, but you can bet that people were far more nativist then. And so it's not because it wasn't there. It's not the demand side, it's the supply side. There was less space for, let's say, far-right parties for 2 reasons. First of all, the past. Right? In the 50s, 60s, any party that spoke about immigration or just the nation or the folk or race would have been linked directly to the Nazis, and there was just no space. The second was that at that point in time, immigration was low. And so for most people, right, first of all, the number of immigrants was small. They were supposed to be guest workers, so they were going to go back. And they lived very isolated from the vast majority of people. They either lived around factories or they lived in the poorest working class areas. Now, that's not where the power is. In the 1970s, 80s, first of all, the guest workers had become permanent immigrants. Second of all, because the families came over, they moved away from those factory locations into areas that were not just working class, but also lower middle class. And as a consequence, these became more legitimate issues, right? So it's not the society so much that has changed, it's the politics that has changed.
Thank you. I think we can move on.
We will move on with the current situation with the European Parliament. With right-wing populist parties gaining more seats now, what implications could this have for the future direction of the European Union, and specifically for its policies, for its debates, or even for its polities? What do you think?
Okay, so I will follow purely on the consequences rather than on the results. What happens is that the power of the EPP is strengthened significantly. The EPP is the only middle group that has been a big winner. Importantly, the EPP has moved even further to the right. This has been going on for over a decade, but certainly this whole campaign was very right-wing, based on pretty much rejection of immigration and the European Green Deal. Some of the parties that won largely in the EPP are parties that belong to the most right-wing faction, like the Partido Popular in Spain, or I would say even the new party in Hungary, as well as, of course, CDU has moved to the right significantly. CDU was for a long time under Merkel pretty much the most moderate, among the most moderate parties in the EPP. Under Merz, the party has moved more to the right. So the EPP is not just bigger, it's also a more right-wing faction than before. There clearly is a majority for its very strict anti-immigration policies in the European Parliament. As to a certain extent there was already. The European Green Deal seems to be largely dead. It was already being killed by von der Leyen as part of her re-election campaign. The one thing, though, well, where it's important to say, yes, the far right has won already to a certain extent before the elections by pushing the EPP into its own issues and frames. It's important not to overstate it, because there is an other element to the EPP's agenda, and that is defense and Ukraine, right? And on that, they don't follow the far right. In fact, on that, they lead the far right. The ECR, right, is largely in line with that, although that's, of course, because of PIS being fundamentally anti-Russian. What I expect is, first of all, that the coalition, the big coalition of EPP, SND, and Renew holds, but A, is much weaker. Renew is much weaker. They losing left and right. Overall, they're now at around under 400 seats with the whole coalition. And of that, almost half is EPP. So the EPP is going to fully dominate that coalition, meaning that the so-called center that has held is an even more right-wing center than it was before. And in addition, EPP can threaten to find a majority with the far right. Now, of course, it will only work officially with the ECR, which it has, and look at when Manfred Weber, but particularly von der Leyen, speak about the far right, they always exclude the ECR. For them, the far right is ID exclusively. So what they will do is they will stay close to ECR, work a lot with Meloni, will not openly work with ID or what will probably be the new group of AfD, but assume that these parties will vote with them anyway. Now, the thing is that a right-wing coalition is unlikely because the far right is so disorganized, right? And so as a consequence, the EPP will not use it all the time. But the EPP is and has always been the most important group, but has become much stronger than before, and has said more right-wing. And this will pay off, I don't think necessarily in a big way, for the simple reason that the EU was already fundamentally anti-immigration, was building a fortress Europe. That will continue, but it can't fundamentally change because almost no one gets in anymore. The Green Deal was kind of dead on arrival. I think in terms of Ukraine, accession, defense, they will try to push to get stuff done, but it will be harder because there are more countries that don't want to give too much power. I think where we see it probably most, although we won't see it, is actually in so-called gender mainstreaming. So the EU has implemented a policy of gender mainstreaming, which means that the gender perspective is included in virtually everything, right? Which makes sense because most policy is made for men, even though it is implicit. And so gender mainstreaming simply means that you think through, like, okay, so how does this affect men? How does it affect women? That is absolutely not popular within the far right, but also not within most of the EPP. And there have been successes over the last 10 years in more progressive policies on gender and sexuality. I do not expect any of those to happen anymore, and probably some will be pushed back.
And I don't get it. Why, in your perspective, do the conservative parties switch to the right? And every expert says that that's no good strategy to gain more votes. I really don't get it. What is your opinion on that point?
Well, I mean, I could make a petty remark about politicians only listen to economists rather than to social scientists. But it's very difficult to explain because it's not only the center-right. The center-left is the same. Just look at the debate currently within the SPD, or in Austria within the SPÖ, or in Flanders in Vooruit. Almost all want the so-called Danish model, right? Embracing a very strict right-wing anti-immigration policy and broader reactionary social-cultural policy against wokeness, etc., etc. Even though we have decades of research showing that it doesn't work. So it's impossible to explain that. I mean, I think it's groupthink. I think people just get stuck in their own discourse. There is another argument which works more for mainstream right. And that is that politics, like many other things these days, are very short-term. So a political leader, once they start, they don't think about where is the party in 10 years. They think about where am I in the next election. Now, embracing the far right can work in the short term. Think about ÖVP, both on the Schüssel in 2000 and then later on the Kurz. So for Schussler and for Kurz, it worked out. After that, the party gets like completely destroyed. But that's not your concern, because if you lose an election, you're gone. And so it is very short-term thinking. And increasingly, the other thing is that politicians are increasingly surrounded by, on the one hand, pollsters, and on the other hand, marketing people. And there are very few people who talk about ideologies. There are very few people who talk about just a ground sociologist, about what's going on in society. So you have a very shallow view. And when you poll, what do you see? People are concerned about immigration. Now, why are they concerned about immigration? In part because the media always talks about immigration, and people are concerned about what the media talks about. And so an ideological politician who's long-term will say, look, this is our position on immigration. We have to change the people to make them like believe in this. That's not what politics is about. Politics is about, how do I win the next election, given that this is the major issue? And so it is a combination of short-sightedness that is inherent in the system and groupthink. And I would say this is one of my major frustrations, because like together with Tariq Abu-Chadi and others, we have been arguing this for over a decade with evidence, empirical evidence. And it doesn't change. It just does not change.
Well, then you have already addressed our next topic, namely how we can change the situation a little bit. You have already described that your advices about how politicians should react to it are not really listened to, but maybe you could give some other advice that will be heard about how civil society and educational initiatives like us could help to counter narratives and the appeal of these right-wing movements.
Okay, let's first go to a meta point. There's a lot of critique that academics live in an ivory tower, and to a certain extent that's true, but it's also never been as little the case as it is today. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of academics who reach out to the media, are available to them, are reasonably decent in explaining their academic research to people. Having done this for many decades now, I notice over the last couple of years, I would say about 10 years or so, that there's less and less reading of academic work by journalists, but to a certain extent also civil society. It's important because things are complex. Like you can invite me and explain to you in an hour what is going on, but if you don't read about the undergoing transformation, it doesn't make much sense. So for example, one of the things that we have to understand is that public opinion is on the one hand real and on the other hand not real. Like public opinion is created. Now it's not only how people think. Like how people think on an issue is kind of decided in their mid-20s. But what they think about can be manipulated and is manipulated all the time. We know that if you talk about immigration the whole time as negative, people will vote, a large portion of people will vote for parties who are negative on immigration. A large part of these same people will vote for something else if climate change is the dominant issue, if education is the dominant issue. So that is important. Like, I mean, agenda setting is one of the key parts of the political struggle. The right is far better on it. I think it's important to understand that the media is not your friend and is not a defender of democracy. The media is a commercial enterprise. And so what you need to do is incentivize journalists to write stories about topics that you find important. Now, how do you do that? Well, in part, people have to read it, right? And so I think we all have a role to play here. But you also have to make stories interesting. the key is not to ignore far-right issues if there are far-right issues. The key is also not to just talk about those issues, but from a different perspective. At the moment, and for several years, immigration, Islam, whatever, are fully occupied by the far right. By having a different discourse on it, the only thing you do is make it more important. So yes, have a different issue, but most importantly, talk about a variety of issues. And like, don't be all the time, don't respond all the time to what comes from the media, which largely comes from the far right. Like, you don't have to talk about housing exclusively in terms of asylum seekers, as we did in the Netherlands, even though only 1 in 10 houses goes to refugees, right? And so focus and show to the media, because in the end, you communicate to the people through the media, show that people are actually concerned about other issues. And people are fundamentally, and also look at subgroups. Women overall have very different priorities than men. In many countries, immigration, crime are top issues for men, but are secondary issues for women. Young people have different interests than older people. Now you can say young people don't vote, but why should young people vote when parties only talk about issues that dominate the agenda for old people? So we have to get away from this homogeneous populist view of the people as a homogeneous bloc that has become increasingly defined as the potential voter of the far right. But we also should understand that this is a process. Like, we got to this after decades of changes. We're not changing that back because we have some successful civil society or media or political campaign. This is going to take a while.
Anyhow, I mean, still, do you have something in mind where you saw some, let's say, some campaign or something that actually managed to work against the right-wing narratives? Do you have some best practice example that you could share with us?
I get this a lot as well, and to be honest, I don't see many successes or long-term successes. Allegedly, the Danish left did very well. It did very well in part by going into the neighborhoods, by having a very clear, different, like, counter-narrative, saying that like diversity works, that like actually the Social Democrats did not advance like the marginalized people, not even the native ones. I personally found the first campaign of Macron in 2017 a very positive campaign. It was not only about the far right is bad. It wasn't a Brexit campaign. Like in Brexit, you had a positively defined campaign by Brexit that said, like, give us power back, sovereignty. Like, you can think whatever you want about it, but it was clearly defined as we're going forward. And you had a Remain campaign that by and large just said the other camp is a disaster. Like, it never defended the EU. In fact, it didn't mention the EU, it mentioned Europe. It just said, look, don't do that. And we're getting into these type of campaigns, right? Don't vote for Trump, that's disastrous. Not vote for me, I'm going to do this. Macron in 2017 had actually a very positive campaign, embraced a multicultural France within the limits of French multiculturalism. It gave kind of a Blairite new élan, right? Which isn't particularly modern, but it was reasonably modern in France. Now, Macron, about 8 years later, is a very different story. He has pretty much given into most of the fear-mongering of the far right about Muslims, about the left. And so that's like my frustration. I always give the example here of AOC, who I believe is a very inspiring politician. It's someone who is not just very good on social media, even though she is phenomenal there, She's also very good when she is in Congress. And she has an ideological project. It's an ideological project that's very ambitious and perhaps utopian in the US context, but it's not an all or nothing thing. She's also relatively realistic in how to achieve that. To a certain extent, Bernie Sanders is the same. I personally don't find him necessarily that inspiring, which is a person of another generation, uses terminology of another generation. And so I think that there is a new generation coming, both on the right, although I see it a little bit less, but certainly on the left, that is creating a discourse that's ideological again, that is radical. And of course, they're young, and therefore they want everything, and they don't want to compromise. And without compromise, you don't get anywhere. But at the same time, given how far we have gone to the far right at the moment, I actually think it is the only way. I think it is the only way to be radically inclusive. Because otherwise, you're just going to get this kind of far right light policy, where people say, oh, we're not the far right. But by and large, what you do is you implement 80% of it. You keep the same frames, you keep the same assumptions. And if you do that, the only thing you do is you hold up the movement to the right. And let me end by saying it's important that we don't doom scroll, which is hard, particularly when you live in the country I live in, with an election hovering above us, right? Yes, we have moved to the far right. At the same time, we had a lot of the policies we now find controversial. They were hegemonic in the 50s, 60s. Patriarchy was the foundation of the welfare state. Heteronormativity, and therefore homophobia, was the foundation of the welfare state. To a certain extent, white supremacy was the basis of the welfare state, because we brought in guest workers so that the white working class could get into the middle class. Those were completely uncontroversial then. They're controversial now. Women's rights today are better in most countries than they were in the 60s, 70s. LGBTQI rights are better now than they were then. Minority representation and voice is better. Is it good? No, certainly not with regard to transgender people or minorities. White women have a pretty decent position, but still not one-on-one with white men, right? So we have made progress. We are at a better place now than we were then. And that is important to see too, because otherwise we get into this doomsday work where that is not empowering. If by and large everyone has given up on the far right, then why should I vote? Why should I get active? But not everyone has done that. In CDU, there's still voices who work against that, right? Those should be empowered too.
Just a side question, because you mentioned him. What do you think about, or not what do you think, but could you understand the strategy of Macron with this calling an election now, or is it just insane in your opinion?
I think it is driven by what Macron's weakness always was, which is his phenomenal ego, as well as his kind of authoritarian personality. For Macron, the current situation is unworkable because he has to compromise. He has lost the majority in parliament. Now, for most politicians, that's just how the world is. Macron feels that this is unworkable. So I think that's one of the key motivations. The other motivation, which is a bit more, I would say, positive, is he looks forward ahead to 2027. And 2027, the far right has a massive chance of winning the presidency. And if they do, they might actually also win a majority in the parliament, and so they can actually govern. So what can he do? He can, on the one hand, build up his successor so that there is someone that has he has destroyed the other party. So that has to kind of come from his party, particularly because he doesn't like the radical left, right? That's difficult, because how do you build your successor up without becoming irrelevant yourself? And Macron's not going to be irrelevant, right? So that was one of the problems. So his very opportunistic, cynical, and realpolitische kind of solution is calling an election. First of all, I'm calling the bluff of the French people, whether they really want the far right or they just want to annoy me, right? The second, again, ego. I'm sure he thinks that he is more popular, and so that people will come to him. But a cynical one is, if I lose, then the far right will have to govern. It will be in a coalition, so they can't get much done. And I'm still there as president and can make sure that they don't do strange things. I think the problem with that for him personally is that his legacy is shot. He will be the lame duck president who has normalized the far right. The second thing is, one assumes that the far right is going to fail or is going to be perceived as failing. And that is incredibly naive. Because the only thing that Bardella, should he become prime minister, have to do is say, look, I've done some of these things, or I tried to do some of these things, but I was stopped because we have Macron as president, and I have to govern with these other parties. So in 2027, vote for Le Pen as president, for me as prime minister, and we're actually going to get it done. So it is a massive gamble, right? The only, and I think ultimately it's a bad one, but I also think it's important that without doing anything, 2027 would also have been a very problematic period. I mean, if you go back finally to the EU, this is almost certainly going to put the EU in a coma. Right? I mean, your government is already in a coma and doesn't get anything done. Macron will be powerless. And without Germany or France, there's nothing, right? Merz is not going to change that. But I mean, that's the state that we're in at the moment. Like, it's easy to say, yeah, this would be better. Like, it would be better if we had a strong liberal democratic president in France and one in Germany, but we don't have those options. They're not there. And I think that is the thing that we should think about, we should reflect upon, right? And the final thing is that also has to do with fragmentation. Like, think about Germany up until, what was it, the 80s, mid-80s, like the two major parties got at least 85% of the vote together, right? Today, they barely get to 50. And CDU-CSU is one of the biggest parties in Europe in terms of support. Every politics is fragmenting. It's sometimes covered up by making large electoral lists like NUP in France, right? But I recently saw a poll, Rassemblement National alone has as many votes as more than 10 left-wing parties together, right? So with that fragmentation, any type of strong government with a clear policy is becoming less common because we are getting bigger and bigger coalitions of free parties, whether they are sitting as parties or as lists, will be the norm in a couple of years. And that's not necessarily bad, it's different. And we should also, our expectation shouldn't be that the SPD wins 40%. That's over. And to a certain extent, like that Merz is doing so well is purely because the SPD is doing so badly. Right? And so well is also very, very limited, because in the historical perspective, of course, the party is still under probably the lowest score of Merkel.
Our last topic is the outlook. In your perspective, what are the implications of this right-wing shift for the future of liberal democracy, minority rights, and the European Union's unity and values?
Well, it's not good, that's for sure. My point, though, is that almost all of these things, the far right is not the only one who is a problem. Liberal democracy has been undermined by so-called mainstream parties in many countries. The VVD in the Netherlands, for example, virtually all party in the wake of 9/11. What we've seen an authoritarian turn in the 21st century with regard to protest, for example, from left and right in many countries. The EU was already dysfunctional or moderately functional at best, well before the far right had any power to push back. A lot of people make a lot out of the pro-Russian position of the far right, but we had Schröder, we had Berlusconi, who were the biggest friends of Putin. So it's important that we don't have this ideal mainstream versus an evil far right. The far right today does a lot of things that are just within the liberal democratic framework, and the mainstream does several things that are outside of it. Now, going forward, I think the most problematic aspect is that we will see even less pressure on member states that undermine liberal democracy. Sure, Hungary probably will still be pressured because they're anti-Ukraine or perceived to be, rather than anything else. But Meloni is still all the time written up as some moderate conservative, even though she tries to fundamentally change the system in Italy, which would give far more power to the executive, which is highly worrying from a perspective of liberal democracy. Minority rights were already not strong. They will be further undermined simply because of the deeply nativist policies with regard to immigration. And so if you consider immigrants as a threat, then anyone who does make it into the country will still be perceived as a potential threat. And we see that, right? I mean, through all kind of weird policies. In the Netherlands, we now recently had in a town, in a city, they gave citizens around a spot where they were going to build an asylum seeker home, something like €1,000 to increase the security in their home. I mean, the message that sends, right, is terrible. And of course, once you have described Muslims or refugees or asylum seekers, whatever it is, as threatening, it's much easier to take away privacy and other types of protections. With regard to the EU, again, it's important to remember that the EU has been stumbling forward pretty much since 1992. Even if the far right had lost, it would stumble forward. It's not because of the far right that it has no Middle Eastern policy. I think some things will happen. So, for example, on accession, this is something that Orban will push. Orban loves to have Western Balkans in the EU because he has various friends there who will provide him with vetoes against sanctioning by the EU. So he wants to get like Macedonia in and particularly Serbia. Ukraine will be problematic, but it will always be problematic because for all the grandstanding of being pro-Ukraine and wanting membership, if Ukraine would actually get into the EU, it would have phenomenal financial consequences that we don't talk about now because we talk about the war, but for which there is absolutely no majority support. And so I don't see a fundamental change for two reasons. First, the far right was already strong. And second of all, the dysfunction of most of our systems are not exclusively the consequence of the far right. They're also because of failures and lack of unity and lack of action within the so-called liberal democratic center.
Well, then, thank you a lot for your time and the insights. And we are looking to discuss your analysis with the participants of our upcoming seminar. We are talking about the issues here. And besides that, we will keep focusing on this topic here in our work. And we're very happy to have you here. Thank you a lot, Cas Mudde. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.